Afternoon, or perhaps good evening or good night, wherever you might be. My name is Salée. I'm a professor of political science at Concordia University, and I will be chairing this session on the intellectual journeys of Ilona Duczynska and Karl Polanyi. We have two speakers for this particular session. Professor András Lacher, who is associate professor of political science at York University in Toronto, where he teaches and researches issues related to political economy, historical materialism, and global capitalism. He's the author of Beyond Globalization, Capitalism, Territoriality, and the International Relations of Modernity. And our second speaker will be Dr. András Göllner, who's a good friend and longtime colleague, who's emeritus professor of political science at Concordia University in Montreal. He has a new edited volume on the 1919 Hungarian Republic of Council, which will be shortly released from Black Rose and University of Chicago Press. His presentation will be on the view of the state held by Ilona Duczynska, the wife of Karl Polanyi, as you all know. So we'll start with you, Professor Lacher, on Karl Polanyi, Intellectual Turning Points, 1886-1964. Professor Lacher.
Thank you. I think I'm sharing my screen here. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're okay. You're good.
Okay. All right. Let me just arrange things here. All right. So my presentation is a sort of general effort to understand the trajectory of Karl Polanyi's thought over the course of his life. It's an effort to specify the critical turning points in his social thought and his political project over the course of his life. Now, I should say this is my first attempt to use Prezi, so I'm not totally familiar with it. I've also ended up somehow adopting a sales pitch template, which sometimes produces sort of funny outcomes. 1964 is in most people's life a bit of a, and death is Polanyi dying in 1964 is for most people a bit of a low point, but here it shows up at the top of things. There's other artifacts that may show up from time to time. I thought this one was quite apt, though, because I do wonder that while Polanyi's stock has been going up for a long, long time, whether there is a bit of a case of mistaken identity, similar to the situation with Elon Musk recently recommending one product by one company and people buying the product or buying the stocks of a similarly named but unrelated company. So as you can tell, this is part of my sort of long-standing endeavor to contest and change the way that Polanyi's political thought and project is generally understood, namely as an argument for regulated capitalism. And necessarily, as I try to lay out these things, I will have to engage with the interpretations of others who have come before me, who have tried to decode the meaning of the Great Transformation, who have constructed narratives and of continuities and discontinuities in Polanyi's thought. Most importantly in this regard, obviously, Bloch and Sommers and their notion of a turn from revolutionary Marxism to some sort of reformist socialism during Polanyi's Bennington years. And on the other hand, Gareth Dale's notion of a larger, longer continuity of Polanyi's commitments to reform socialism from the 1910s to the Great Transformation and beyond. And my focus here will be mostly on the second of those. I won't say too much on Bloch and Sommers. I've had my say, and I will have another opportunity to respond to their reply in writing. And so here in this context, I'm largely focusing on Dale. All right, now, to my mind, 1933 is probably the most pivotal turning point in Polanyi's thought, and that's the argument that I'm going to present. the period from 1933 to 1947 really, to my mind, stands out as a special period in Polanyi's thought, and with the great transformation at its almost end point. But my focus will really be on what comes before and what comes after in this presentation, rather than on this period, even though I will obviously have to say a few things. And even as I do make the argument for 1933 as a real breaking point, I do have to acknowledge that there are quite significant, more long-lasting continuities that persist partly throughout Polanyi's life, and perhaps none of them is more important ultimately than the prophecy, as he himself repeatedly referred to it, that he issued in 1910 in an article called "The Crisis of Our Ideologies." So this comes in the context, as Polanyi himself suggests, of him breaking with and rejecting the positive determinist tradition of Marxism as it was understood at the time, right? And we certainly do see a very distinctive and idiosyncratic and dark vision of the future expressed here that is quite at odds with the optimism of much of Marxism at this point. So he says in this is a quote from 1943, where he refers back to 1909 or 1910, really, when this was published. This is at the moment that he's publishing The Great Transformation, where he points back to this and says, well, that's when I forecast a complete reversal in the dominant philosophy of Western civilization. I asserted that collectivism would become the state religion under a monopolistic form of capitalism. Liberty, individuality would all give way to something else. Democracy would be replaced by a quasi-religious conviction of the inferiority of the masses. The working class would be betrayed by its own specific philosophy. And all of this, he said, would result in the non-too-distant future from the anticipated substitution of competitive by a regulated capitalism. Now, I think Dale is quite right in pointing out that this really was a pivotal moment, and that this statement in many ways has shaped Polanyi's thinking through the ages. But I'm not entirely sure that I would agree with the way Dale frames this. What he sees in this is largely as a result of Polanyi pointing to the dynamics of regulated capitalism and so on. He sees in this, Polanyi siding with Bernstein, and he continues to say, he predicted that the next period of the capitalist age will produce largely stable conditions of material existence, and concluded that a tendency towards stabilization will be its main feature. And so for Dale, this is the sort of starting point of Polanyi's lifelong engagement or membership in the reformist socialist movement that sought to transform capitalism into a socialist society by means of parliament-led piecemeal alterations to existing institutions. And I think in many ways that is right. What we do see subsequent to 1910 is Polanyi's politics largely being circumscribed by that sort of reform socialist perspective, first in the form of the orientation towards the liberal socialism of Bernstein and so on, and then the more guilt socialist articulations in the 1920s. That he derives from Otto Bauer and Kohl and so on. But it does seem to me that it's important to note in all of this that if Polanyi here, starts his lifelong concern with regulated capitalism, and even though he does join the broadly reform socialist movement, ultimately the vision that he articulated here couldn't be more different from what reform socialists like Bernstein and so on were hoping would occur from the encroachment, the imposition of socialist elements onto capitalist societies, what would happen with the increasing strength of the working classes in parliament, the ability to gradually contain and then supplant capitalism with some sort of socialism. What Polanyi articulated is very much the opposite, right? The fear that what would happen would not be the replacement and supplantation of capitalism by socialism, but rather the appropriation, the utilization of socialist ideologies for and within a capitalist society of increased forms of and contributing to increased forms of oppression, stable perhaps, but in a very oppressive and exploitive sort of fashion, right? So the prophecy is not exactly, you know, it's in many ways entirely opposite to what the hope and expectation of reform socialists was. Nevertheless, I think it is true that that Polanyi subsequently embraces an almost exuberantly idealistic form of socialism, as if he was determined to prove his own premonitions wrong, for a while denying most structural compulsions and all of this, and ending up in a set of really astonishing publications around 1919, 1920, 2021, and so on, that sort of formed the high point of that liberal socialism. 1922 is a bit of a turning point in the sense that I think it's at that point Polanyi starts to take structural conditions, institutional contexts more seriously, that he starts to reckon with what he later would come to call the reality of society, the compulsions exerted by the institutional structures of society, the need to make social choices, including the consolidation and extension of socialism, and the way in which that might itself require force and compulsion, something that he had strongly rejected in the early 1920s. So there's a certain shift, and certainly we do see Polanyi laying the foundations and tapping into ideas and appropriating them for himself in ways that would certainly come back during the 1930s, if in a very different form, I will suggest, down the road. Right. So what we do see is not after 1923 is, as Dale points out, a cementation of his reform socialist commitments, but also the assumption of a new form and the introduction of new elements into that. Into his reformist socialism. In particular, I think the deepening of his ethical socialism and of the critique of capitalism that is not based on the critique of exploitation and immiseration, but on alienation and on the impossibility of a good life after under capitalist conditions. Right. And so here in these regards, I think we can, with that sort of ethical focus, we can certainly start to see elements shining through that ultimately are critical of the reform socialist sort of process. But I think it is important to note that up until 1933, I would certainly characterize, along with Dale, I would characterize Polanyi's thought as largely falling within that general framework and within that movement. So where I start to differ, right, is the idea, differ from Dale, is the idea that we can project this continuity, that long-standing commitment to reform socialism from the 1910s and 1920s in different forms and guises, to be sure, but nevertheless that we can sort of project that forward and see the great transformation as largely coming out of that broad trajectory. Clearly, there are many elements that do get carried forward from the 1920s to the 1930s. It's functionalism that he appropriates from Guild socialism. his conceptualization of capitalism as market society, his turn towards Hayek and Mises as the most important interlocutors, as the most important critics of organized capitalism, rather than rather than taking Marxism as a particularly relevant critique of capitalism and theory of capitalism and so on. Right. So in all of these ways, there are elements that certainly do get carried forward, and yet it seems to me that things really do change in 1933, because what Polanyi recognizes, I think, at this point, in the aftermath already of the defeat of Red Vienna, but then with fascists coming to power in Austria and Germany, elsewhere as well, and Polanyi himself being forced to move to Britain in this situation. I think what Polanyi recognizes and what we see throughout the 1930s and then culminating in the Great Transformation is, in a word, the complete, utter, and total defeat of the Reform Socialist hopes and aspirations and of the Reform Socialist movement. Right? And it's, I think, out of that recognition that all of these efforts had ultimately led not to the hoped for supplantation of capitalism with socialism, but rather to the fascist revolution, that I think an astonishingly creative and productive effort arose to redeploy some of the conceptual and theoretical tools that he had been developing over the course of the 1920s for the elucidation of what had gone wrong and for the articulation of a radical revolutionary socialism, not of a Marxist type, to be sure, but in some ways he thought of a more radical and more revolutionary orientation than Marxism could provide. And what really allows him, or what forces him to, what enables him to reframe and re-articulate these earlier ideas is that the centrality of the notion of the incompatibility of capitalism and democracy, that now throws a different light on this, and that allows him to move towards a critical functionalism that I think is quite different from what he had embraced earlier on, and so on. And so it's I think that recognition that leads to that wholesale reframing of his projects and his turn towards away from reformist socialism to revolutionary socialism. And so in many ways, of course, and he makes that connection himself many times in 1933, 1934, and so on, in many ways, right? This harks back, some of these ideas hark back to what he had articulated in that 1910 article, that the idea that capitalism and democracy may have been compatible in an earlier phase of liberal capitalist development, but were no longer compatible in the present. I'll just read this to you. The assumption that universal suffrage was incompatible with the private ownership of the means of production did not prove true. During the major part of the 19th century, the question took a different form when laissez-faire gave way to regulated capitalism. So in many ways, that sort of stagist sort of understanding of the different modalities of capitalism here comes back, but it's now articulated in very different forms than in 1910, right? Back then it was framed as the sort of what happens when you have that general move from competitive to monopoly or competitive to regulated capitalism. What stands in for that, or what comes to replace that, is that critical functionalism that he now deploys in a new fashion that allows him to put that idea of the impairment of the market and the endangerment of society resulting from that at the center of his analysis and at the center of his understanding of what fascism means. So he says in 1933, the left is the true creator of democracy, but when the left seeks to use democracy as a political mechanism, in the struggle between competing economic interests, it must fail because capitalist exchange economy responds to interferences with the market mechanism with a shrinking of the national product. All of these statements that we see Polanyi starting to frame and work out and so on in that period are efforts to understand how you had gone from a situation where socialism seemed to have made significant inroads into capitalism and ultimately failed to succeed, and what had precipitated that capitalist onslaught that he decoded as the essence of fascism. So it seems to me that the notion that we can see this period and the Great Transformation as a sort of continuation of Polanyi's reform socialist ideas in the 1920s seems to me quite problematic. The idea that, as Dale suggests here, that islands of socialism can be securely planted within capitalist society, that actually existing democracy in the political sphere provided the platform on which socialist democracy could be constructed. All of that, I think, for Polanyi become very clear, did not work out. And he's now trying to work out why and to make an argument for revolutionary socialism that ultimately, I think, comes to fruition in the Great Transformation, which I think is best understood as that sort of effort to warn the working class into once more putting their faith and their stock in whether it's social democracy or reform socialism, and the need to recognize the need for a radical departure from capitalist society.
András, you have 1 minute left, please.
Okay. All right. So I think Polanyi articulates that sort of critique of reform socialism in a statement here from 1936, where he says, you know, the discrepancies between actual development and that foreshadowed in socialist theory can be made. Socialism had fixed its vision exclusively on exploitation by private ownership, on nationalization as its antidote. But the actual process was that of a reaction to laissez-faire. And it's that theoretical framework that I think he then carries forward into the Great Transformation. So I'll skip over quite a bit of stuff here. I'll move forward to 1947, just to summarize that by 1947, I think Polanyi is very clear that none of his hopes, that his political project had largely failed, that he was a voice in the wilderness, as he calls it, right? And we do think, I think we do see him in the aftermath of that, as he returns to the United States until about 1956, sort of trying to grapple with what had gone wrong, trying to grapple with the United States and the way in which it presented so many anomalies for him, partly making his peace with it, partly remaining entirely deeply critical of it. But then I try to show, and that's very, just 15 seconds or so, and I try to show how in the course of 1956, around 1956, with the Hungarian uprising and the Congress, the 20th Congress of the CPSU, the de-Stalinization process, Polanyi ultimately returned to a more radical formulation where he ultimately hoped, quite wrongly, I think, to for any sort of realization of his vision to come from the democratization of really existing communism in the Soviet Union, rather than to come from any deepening of the welfare state in Western capitalism and so on. And he's also highly critical of the golden age of capitalism and the loss of freedom and all of this. So I think that return towards a radical socialism here, largely shorn of analytical and explanatory foundations, but as a sort of ethical recommitment, stands at the end of Polanyi's life after a period of 10 years of wavering and wondering where he had gone wrong and so on. All right, I leave it at that. And yes.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. This was a great overview. I'm sure we'll have questions about this. Our next paper is from Dr. András Göllner. It's on Ilona Duczynska and the State in the Age of Artificial Reality, from Aristotle to Subcomandante Marcos. Dr. Göllner.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Am I coming through?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, let me preface by saying that my internet seems to be a little bit unstable. I don't know what's going on. So I hope it's not going to create any problems. But let's dive in and see where we end up. Anyways, I enjoyed listening to Hannes. Unfortunately, he was cutting out a few times, so I don't know whether the problem is at my end or it was at his end. So I want to thank, first of all, congratulate the organizers for their courage in looking ahead, taking on this challenge of looking at how the pandemic will affect the functioning of the state in the second half of the 21st century. And also, I want to thank them for giving a broader window of opportunity to us by looking at some of the other trends that are taking place right now that will affect the operation of the state as we go forward. So I have taken the liberty of this window of opportunity and thank the organizers for allowing me to address this learned gathering on the broader spectrum. To put it simply, I'm going to be looking at the culture of the pandemic, the culture of the virus, rather than the virus itself. I'm going to be looking at the culture that is producing the kind of artificial reality that we are seeing unfolding around us. The initial signals of that, the embryonic signals, came at the turn of the 20th century with the so-called linguistic turn. Stronger signals emanated in the middle of the 20th century from Horkheimer, the works of Horkheimer and Adorno in their dialectic of the Enlightenment. Of course, Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation also alludes through his reference to the fictional basis of the commodification of land, capital, and labor. And then, of course, we get this drift towards artificial reality, decoded by the postmodern writers Baudrillard, Diderot, Derrida, Foucault, and others, until we get up to the current time, which is the one that we are living under at the headquarters of universal capitalism, where we see a Trump regime for which truth and the ability and the efforts to destroy the capacity of ordinary human beings to distinguish between reality and fiction, truth and falsehood, fiction and factual narratives is at its height. So I'm going to be talking about this culture and how that culture is going to impact, how I think that culture is going to impact upon the state through the lens of Ilona Duczynska, the wife of Karl Polanyi. In a nutshell, that's my aim. I want to see whether Ilona Duczynska's view of the state can hold up to this spinning towards artificial reality at a more increasingly rapid rate. What was her view of the state? How is it related to Aristotle, to antiquity, to ancient views of the state, and the postmodern view of the state, exemplified by Subcomandante Marcos, who is the leader, spokesperson rather, I should say, of the Liberation Army of the Zapatistas of Mexico. So why Ilona Duczynska? Why have I chosen her? who is not known really as a theorist, but as an activist. I've chosen her because I knew her. She was a friend of mine. When I was fresh out of graduate school, just received my doctorate. And I spent during the last 3 years of her life discussing at length the topic I'm going to be talking to you about. I've not only known her, I was a friend of hers, and I also have known and been a friend to Ilona's daughter, of course, Carrie, who is my neighbor here in Montreal, and I know the entire family. I didn't know Karl Polanyi because he passed when I was still in high school. So I know Ilona, I'm very familiar with her work, and I also wanted to talk about her, not because of our friendship and my knowledge of her ideas, but also because of the respect that I have for her approach to the challenges that are facing us today. Karl was a theorist, a writer, a thinker. Ilona was an activist, a warrior. Karl traveled on the open highways in broad daylight. Ilona traveled under the cover of darkness, using assumed names. She had a conspiratorial bent. Most of the time, she was dedicated to leaving as small a footprint behind her as possible in order to better achieve the objectives that she had, which was to provide a better world, a better community based on friendship and solidarity for those whose lives mattered the most to her, namely the working men and women, the underclass, the underprivileged, the dispossessed, the abused. So I have a great affinity for her, for the approach that she takes, and I think that she deserves some attention, even though her signals are rather faint. The main source of her ideas are found in Workers in Arms, a book that she published that came out. She finished in 1975, but came out just before her passing, where she addresses one of the important variables of the state, namely the utilization of force and violence. So let's jump into the fray. First, a couple of words about the conventional view of the state. The conventional view of the state that we teach our students in political science is that the state stands on 4 legs: people, territory, governments, and sovereignty. And we get into the discussion then of this conventional view. There is also the Weberian view, of course, which says that the defining attribute of the state is the monopoly over the legitimate use of force on the territory of the state. Now, Ilona, and one more thing I wanted to add to this traditional picture that we have of the state, and that is that we tend to look upon the state as an invention of Western Europeans, especially since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, that the state is a West European invention that was given to the people of the world as a gift during the processes of colonialization. Little bit of a tongue twister. Now, Ilona rejected that view, and she shares Aristotle's view, which is that the state goes back virtually to the time of the agricultural revolution and is intimately bound up with the idea of settlement, settling down, and the idea of providing community of men and women with a sustainable habitat, ecologically sustainable habitat based on justice, equal opportunity, equal rights under a constitution, and freedom. So, how did Ilona get to Aristotle? She had an affinity for Aristotle from her childhood, from her early teens. She read or read into the politics as a young teenager, because she found the book on her father's bookshelf and became fascinated with it, and recognized that Aristotle's idea of the state, which can be perfected in a manner that caters to the well-being of the community in a sustainable fashion based on friendship rather than on subjugation, because subjugation for Aristotle was characteristic of most variants of the state, but a state based on friendship, on philia, based on community, that is based on communities that are sustainable, i.e., that are independent and self-sustaining, is the kind of community that she wanted to see for those with whom she had an affinity with, which, as I said, were the working men and women of the world. So for her, Aristotle was a great beacon of light, and she recognized the connectivity between the ideas of Aristotle, the ideas of Rousseau, who also rejected the Hobbesian idea that the state of nature was a cruel, difficult, harsh environment. For Rousseau and for Ilona and for Aristotle and for Polanyi himself, the state of nature was not a harsh place. The state of nature was one where human beings existed in friendship and simply came together to form a state, form the state out of their free will, in order to make their communities more sustainable, not more sustainable, but to be sustainable.
We've frozen.
He seems to have frozen.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. You were frozen for a little while there.
So frozen for a while. How much time do I have, Danielle? Where are we?
You have about 6-7 minutes.
Okay, so I'm gonna speed it up. So, anyways, there was this great affinity with Rousseau, with Aristotle. She recognized the line cutting through from Rousseau to Kropotkin, to Rosa Luxemburg, of course, and to Anton Pankow, the Dutch Marxist, who we recognize as the founder of council socialism. So Ilona was a person who, at a very young age, tuned into this this line of thought, this stream of consciousness, which emphasizes solidarity, emphasizes the organization of the state based on the free union of free men and women committed to the goal of ecologically sustainable development along the path of justice and equality before the law. She was the person who, I think, and many would argue, is the one who lit the fuse to the revolutions of 1918, 1919 in Hungary, which culminated in the Republic of Councils in 1919, which was the ideal state for Ilona. The ideal state because it was a state which was committed to eliminate capitalism and to put workers through workers' councils, workers, soldiers, and peasant councils, give them executive, legislative, and judicial supremacy. The constitution of that republic was an astonishing document, and you can find it on the internet. And it very much coincided with the Pankokian view. In fact, Pankok was named an honorary member. Anton Pankok was made and Rosa Luxemburg were both made an honorary members of the Workers' and Soldiers Council of Greater Budapest, nominated by none other than Béla Kun, the so-called Bolshevik, who had not read Lenin's State and Revolution at that point, and neither did Lukács, for that matter, George Lukács, and he confesses to that in his History of Class Consciousness, the 1967 edition. They were all prisoners, not prisoners, but followers of a West European rather than a Bolshevik, Russian Bolshevik concept of the state based on council socialism, based on governance from below, and the organization of local councils percolating upwards to a national Congress of Councils. Now, Ilona, as time went on after the start of the 1919 Republic of Councils, became disillusioned with what she saw around her in Hungary. And by the second month of that 4-month republic, she was gone. She was in Switzerland under an assumed name, working at a rather menial job. From there, she went to Moscow in 1920, still sharing the same illusions, the same views, participated in the Second Congress of the Comintern, worked closely in the preparation of that Congress, but more importantly, worked as the liaison person between the most important delegation to the Congress, the German Communist delegation to the Congress, and Karl Radek, Zinoviev, and Bukharin, who were the chief organizers of that place. She became disillusioned with Moscow as well.
András, 2 minutes.
2 minutes? Okay. So she became disillusioned with the situation in Russia as well under the Leninist approach, went back to Vienna, to Red Vienna, and was kicked out of the Hungarian Communist Party by 1922. In any event, Ilona was not and never was a true Leninist or a true Bolshevik. Her concept of the state, which is very similar to the concept of the state of the Zapatistas as well, and the national liberation movements, the religious, theologist, socialist theological movements of Latin America, where they see a much looser, from the bottom-up approach rather than a vanguard-led approach to the organization of the state and the management of the affairs of the state. So it's important to recognize her as a genuine revolutionary in the tradition of Rousseau, in the tradition of the Narodniks of Russia in the mid 19th century, one who had a great affinity for Kropotkin, had a great affinity for the Hungarian anarchist Batthyány, of course, a close affinity with the thinking of her mentor Ervin Szabó, a very unique socialist whose design and idea of the state was one based on council socialism rather than on the type of top-down, vanguard-led socialism or communism of Lenin. So I think that's about all I could squeeze into this 15 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
My friend, thank you very much. I will ask the audience. There's a number of participants who are there, so if you have any questions, please write them down in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. At the moment, there is no question. So maybe let me ask the both of you if first of all, András, to what extent, and perhaps Hannes as well, to what extent did each influence each other? Did Ilona influence Karl and Karl influence Ilona, or was that not at all an issue? András.
Well, would you like me to start? Well, I think the love affair with Aristotle was mutual, and perhaps we can say that it was accidental because they both came to Aristotle separately and individually, but they reinforced each other throughout their life together. Karl Polanyi's classical bow to Aristotle is a piece that he wrote on and called Aristotle Discovers the Economy. And it's an homage. I actually have a brief quotation here that I will read if I may. It'll just take me a minute, okay? But this is Karl's view, okay? He says, Aristotle attacked the problem of man's livelihood with a radicalism of which no later writer on the subject was capable. None has ever penetrated deeper into the material organization of man's life than Aristotle. Now, this is an astonishing statement because he excludes Marx. He singles out Aristotle as the person who made the most important impact on him. And he goes on to say that community, self-sufficiency, and justice were Aristotle's focal point. Members of the community are linked by the bond of goodwill, philia, without which the community could not remain. Philia expresses itself in a behavior of reciprocity, that is, readiness to take on burdens in turn and share mutually. Anything that is needed to continue and maintain the community, including its self-sufficiency, autarkia, is natural and intrinsically right. So, to conclude, community, self-sufficiency, and justice, these pivots of his sociology were the frame of reference of his thought on all economic matters, whether the nature of the economy or policy issues were at stake. So just to add a sentence to this, this is a phenomenally important statement by Karl Polanyi, which Ilona, of course, endorsed because she read everything that Karl wrote, and he acknowledges her input. But it's tremendously important because it situates Karl Polanyi's thinking as well as Ilona's thinking on this line that stretches from Aristotle to the jungles of Mexico and the Zapatistas movement. It's an amazing linear progression.
Thank you. András, do you have any, would you like to add something from your perspective? You're muted.
Sure. I don't have too much to say. I'm not really sure I have a grasp on that. The archival materials, I think, are surprisingly silent in this regard. We do see, in the letters that Karl writes once he's at Bennington, we do see a certain sense of a shared project. We see him making reference to the sort of ideas that they had been discussing over the preceding years and so on. So there's that sort of sense that this has become a bit of a shared thing, although just how far that goes is extremely hard to gauge. I think also that Ilona's experiences as a militant, as a warrior, as András put it, did in some ways shape Polanyi's understanding of what had gone wrong in the 1930s with the onslaught of fascism and the capitulation of the socialist working class movement, social democratic or communist in Central Europe. I think it was very much fed by Ilona's experiences as she stayed behind when Karl moved to London in 1933, her staying behind in Vienna, taking up the fight against fascism, against the fascists and so on. And I think, her experiences certainly, I think, ultimately shaped Polanyi's, Karl's understanding of what had gone wrong and just how complete that collapse of the socialist resistance had proven to be, and led him to ask questions of what had gone wrong, deeper questions of what had gone wrong with the socialist working class and its philosophical foundations as well as organizations.
Yeah. We do have a question, a comment actually from one of the attendees, who says, fascinating two papers. András outlines Ilona's view of the state, which seems to me to echo Karl's rather assumed view of the state. However, Karl fails to develop those views, so I'm wondering if András thinks that Ilona's view was shared by Karl, and what both speakers think of Karl's apparent lack of interest in developing a more worked out view of the state and its role. András, you want to try that one?
Well, just a couple of snap responses rather than a lengthy verbose response. Ilona and Karl were absolutely elated, both, with what happened in Hungary in 1956. And what happened to them was the rebirth of a tradition that was covered up after 1919 by the so-called Horthy regime, and initially through the Stalinist years in Hungary after 1945, the rebirth of council socialism. The heart and soul of the 1956 uprising in Hungary was the workers' councils of Greater Budapest, and both Ilona and Ilona, of course, was a chief advocate of this model of the state, but Karl as well were elated to see it re-emerge, and were very saddened to see it once again be destroyed and brought under the military and bureaucratic control. So they shared a similar optimism about that model, and they wrote about it. Ilona wrote wonderful articles for a while in 1956, 1957 in Munkás, which is a communist paper in Canada, was published in Canada. Copies of it are available, and so that unity is there. But why Karl didn't go forward in his discussion of the state, other than the early reflections, I think a hint to that direction is given by a recent piece that I enjoyed reading, and salute Gareth Dale in just this past month, in which he in perhaps slightly critical manner points out that after 1950, Karl Polanyi decided to push more in the direction of economic anthropology rather than in the direction of criticizing, dissecting, and reconstructing a post-capitalist state. Now, why Karl went into that direction is there are many questions about that. My feeling is, and I think Carrie shares that, is that that was the only road possible for him to travel. Remember, 1950 is the year of McCarthyism, the start of McCarthyism, and for Karl to survive in the United States, I mean, Ilona wasn't allowed into the U.S. because of her views and allegiances. Karl was allowed in and was able to teach at Columbia. If he had gone down the path that Ilona was traveling on, he would have been risking his life as an academic. And that was his life. His life wasn't the back alley. His life wasn't working under pseudonyms with trying to leave small footprints. He wanted to leave a big footprint, and he did so. And the only way that he could do that was to look backwards rather than forwards. And so I think that is my explanation of Polanyi's less confrontational approach towards capitalism. And his more, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, András. András, the comment that I just read talks about Karl's apparent lack of interest in developing a more worked out view of the state and its role. What do you respond to that? Do you agree?
It seems to...
Well,
sorry, András, I'm talking to András.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes,
go ahead,
yes.
András.
It seems to me that there is a very interesting theory of the state, right? That is really quite radically different from what we see in Marxism during that period of the 1930s that he works to. That sort of idea that ultimately the idea that capitalism and socialism can only exist as fully complete and self-contained systems, and that the interpenetration of one by the other, of capitalism by socialism in the aftermath of the 1870s had ultimately led to that impairment. But the important thing there is, right, the framing of the role of the state as a repository of the common interest, of the interest of society activated by social movements, but also by concerns of the state and state leaders themselves in terms of the ability of having soldiers capable of defending the realm and all of this. There's a very interesting and perhaps not fully worked out theory of the state that I think Gareth has perhaps not fully grasped, even though I do think that a lot of his efforts to show some of the assumptions, the state theoretical assumptions that pervade Polanyi's work are extremely valuable. So I think as far as he goes, I think he's quite right, but I think he misses out a few critical elements. But perhaps I can address Marci's question as well here.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, you can read it. Okay. So.
Okay, I can. Sure. Yeah. Shall I read it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
My question is whether you agree that Polanyi's socialism was not in contradiction with his admiration for Red Vienna in the context of a very conservative Austria, and his positive reception of the post-war welfare state, given what preceded it, without any way diminishing his commitment to socialism, nor his critique of capitalism. Now, I take this in two parts. I'm not sure that he had a positive reaction to the welfare state after World War II. I don't really see this. I'm far more convinced by that characterization of Ilona's that marks him out as having had a revulsion for the Swedish welfare state and all of this. So I'm not sure about this. When it comes to Red Vienna, I am very much convinced that Red Vienna was his lodestar. Absolutely, that his imagination, his view of human improvement, of the improvements of the working class, of an autonomous life and all of this, were fundamentally shaped during and through that experience in Vienna. And that in some ways for his whole during the rest of his life that remained part of his vision of socialism and so on. However, I think it's critical to remember that Red Vienna was defeated, right, and that fascism ultimately undid even more than just these things. And I think that's what Polanyi responded to in the 1930s. He creatively responded to the recognition that the hopes and expectations that had guided the reformist socialist movement in Europe had ultimately been dashed and proven to be an illusion, a failure. And so the experience of Red Vienna, I think, and the defeat and then the fascist takeover, I think, are critical to understanding that turn towards revolutionary socialism in the 1930s. I should say that revolutionary socialism was perhaps a reluctant one. If I ever write a book, finally putting my ideas on Polanyi together, I'm going to call it The Reluctant Revolutionary, because I don't think he was a revolutionary by inclination, by temperament, and so on, as András earlier on pointed out. I think he would have been perfectly happy for socialism to come in the way that, the reform socialist movement and so on hoped it would happen, through gradual reform and through the gradual colonization and supplantation of capitalism by socialism. What changed for him was the recognition that had turned out to be, well, a failure, right? And that it had opened the way, and then his articulating the theory behind it in terms of the impairment of the market through regulated capitalism and so on, that had led him, against his inclinations, against his temperament and so on, to ultimately conclude that really socialism needed to be achieved by more revolutionary means than had been the guiding assumption during the 1920s and 1930s. And yet, one might say that what he hoped that revolutionary socialism would establish was probably not too far away from what Red Vienna had achieved, or what Red Vienna was aiming for, right? And so he was hoping to secure that sort of thing, that sort of constellation in a more complex and reinforced sort of set of institutions that where political and economic elements would reinforce each other rather than leave that experiment exposed to the onslaught from the enemies of these experiments. So I think that's how I would think about this. So absolutely, I do think Red Vienna does remain crucial, and was never in his mind. That never left his imagination as an approximation of how a socialist society should function.
Margie adds in another comment, in the latter part of his life, Polanyi's For a New West brings back his deep critique of capitalism.
And I did have a few slides on that, and his critique of Galbraith's affluent society, where he reacts very violently against that notion of, or where he reacts against the pleasures and wonders of the golden age of capitalism, where he insists that that's not really what's at issue, right? That this is not really what society should be striving for, but that it's freedom and control over the circumstances of individual and social life that should be the purpose of social reorganization. So I completely agree that it's in that period with the New West formulations, with the declaration of the West as culturally bankrupt, and so on. And then just to take up Patricia's comment here, and then basically looking towards on the one hand the Soviet Union, right, in terms of a post-Stalinist sort of reorganization, his hopes for that, but also looking towards Asia in particular, where he thought that industrialization would take place in a very different form. And these are all small scattered thoughts that we can glean right from that period. But where he certainly developed hopes that in these areas, non-capitalist form of industrialization would take shape. And that, of course, ultimately didn't go very far.
You partly answered Patricia's comment, but András, Patricia says to both speakers, could you comment if Karl and Ilona were also following the revolutionary movements that were taking place in the global South? Have these movements influenced their thought? András?
Well, Ilona certainly was. I'm not familiar with Karl's pursuits with that respect, but Ilona certainly was. She was absolutely. I mean, Ilona's position was the following: with Stalinism, the single model of socialism and communism has broken down, and she goes on to say, and I'm now referring to Workers in Arms and the last part of her book, where she makes more or less the same criticism, and it's quite brazen of her, of the attempts by post-Stalinist communist regimes in Central Europe, which she calls contradictory steps, and categorically states that there's no model. The models that have emerged in Central Europe after Stalin, she dismisses as contradictory, as unworkable, unsustainable. And she puts her faith into the models that are being worked out in less dogmatic environments, communities of the so-called Third World, the revolutionary movements, which are far more open to the kind of spontaneous, direct democracy that she supported and lived for in 1919, that she applauded in Hungary's case in 1956. And what most people don't know, even Carrie didn't know of this until I reminded her, that Ilona, in her conspiratorial ways, was one of the prime movers of the anti-Kadar dissident movement in Hungary in the late 60s, early 1970s. She played a prominent role, and she's an unsung hero of the struggle against that contradictory construction, that blind alley that was based on the same kind of artificial reality as Karl Polanyi points out, the commodification of land, labor, and capital was. So she certainly had her cards in the revolutionary movements of Latin America, Africa. Her bookshelves, and they're still here in Montreal, in her grandson's Tom's possession. She has a whole bunch of books on the revolutionary movements, on Frantz Fanon, Che, the Zapatistas, the Tupameros. That's where her heart was, and that's where her mind was, and that is where her idea of the state, the possibility for a renewal of the state, is located.
What about you, András, and Polanyi in the global South? You want to add further on this?
No, I do think he pushed in that direction in the late 1950s and 60s. He started to make connections. He was tremendously impressed by Emanuel Wallerstein's early formulations and so on. But I mean, it's hard to gauge exactly what it all adds up to, right? There are no more systematic sort of articulations at that point in the late 1950s and 1960s. There's fragments. There's efforts to to go in certain directions. There's suggestions that something important is happening here or there and so on, right? But of course, there's nothing that ultimately really comes out of these efforts. And so, and I do think that, you know, Polanyi in some ways is in some ways lost by what was happening, partly looking for signs of vindication that things were moving in his direction, and partly utterly despondent by the recognition that so many things were not going in the direction that he was hoping for or had predicted. So yes, he did, you know, the sort of idea that in the global South, something was happening, something was emerging that might provide new impetus towards the future that he had envisaged. That was very tempting to him and attractive in all of this. But to what extent, you know, I certainly don't see a sort of, you know, sustained effort to engage or grapple with this.
Thank you. We have barely 2 minutes left. So any last comments, things that you would like to say that you must absolutely say that you didn't have the opportunity rather to say? András?
I think I'll pass. I think I've said enough.
Okay, thank you.
Same here. Same here.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. And I guess that concludes our session on the intellectual journeys of Ilona Duczynska and Karl Polanyi. Thank you all, and we'll see you in the other panels.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.